These days, it seems that our society is more divided than ever. Whether it's divisions over race, gender, sexuality, or anything else, there's always a certain way those divisions are framed in terms of the oppressed and the oppressor, and how people in those categories should think about the nature of their oppression and the solution to remedy it, which usually amounts to dismantling our existing society and implementing a new glorious utopian system that has no such flaws. Now, the arguments about oppression can be very compelling. Overcoming oppression can only be good, right? Well, it all comes down to who gets to define what constitutes oppression, and which people can claim the identity of the oppressed and leverage that claim to dismantle our social institutions. There's a pattern which is developed about how to divide society into oppressors versus oppressed and drive this conflict. And it all started with German philosopher Karl Marx. Now, Marx saw the world through a lens which divided society into those who had wealth and capital and those who did not. The wealthy, or bourgeois, were privileged, and the poor workers, the proletariat, were the oppressed. He had a lot more to say about economics and history and philosophy, but one remarkably effective thing that he did was to lay out a pattern for framing the division between these two groups as the result of existing structures in society, something we would later call the system. And he provided a narrative that both fueled the resentment and division between the groups and pointed to a revolutionary outlook that sought to overthrow rather than reform existing institutions. Consider it a Marxist conflict paradigm. And here's how it worked. So Marx saw the world through this economic class lens, and that's how he divided society. He came out with a manifesto that described his ideas. The bourgeoisie constructed an idea called economic class. Being bourgeois gave one access to a special type of property called capital or wealth, which was a privilege. The oppressed underclass, which are the proletariat, are excluded from these benefits. The bourgeoisie created an ideology called capitalism to maintain and justify this state of affairs. It permeates and structures society. Now, this structure is essentially those systems of ideas which allow things like private property, individual rights, to hold everything together that's necessary for capitalism. Now, all of this falls under the heading of liberalism. This structure is determinate, which means that your individual identity is irrelevant. Who you are, what you can think, your character, all of this is determined by your position within this structure, which is entirely determined by your economic class. Now, this ideology is mythological. It's essentially a false story that everyone tells themselves because they believe it like a religion. Thus, the oppressor class are made to believe that they deserve the capital and the wealth privilege, while those in the oppressed class are brainwashed to accept it. Those in the underclass, the infrastructure, have no ability to influence society. Only those in the upper class, the superstructure, have this power. The goal of Marxism is to awaken the economic class consciousness in the underclass so that they can agitate for it to also awaken in the bourgeoisie allies, who will become the vanguard in a revolution to overthrow the existing society and to replace it with a system that has no such faults. So you can basically take this narrative that's laid out in the Marxist Manifesto and pick out certain aspects of it. So you can think of a way to divide people. The dividing factor in the case of Marx's first analysis, it was economic class. Who were the winners? Well, the wealthy, the bourgeoisie. Who were the losers? The workers, the poor, the proletariat. What gives the winners their status? What's their status marker? Well, it was the privilege that went along with the wealth and capital that they had. What is the ideology that enables this? For Marx, it was capitalism. And what is the system that enables the ideology? Well, we already talked about how things like property rights, contract law, and individual rights were the fuel that's needed in order for capitalism to actually work, and those are all under the umbrella of liberalism. And what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? Well, in Marx's case, it was Marxism. But what this did is it provided a template that subsequent people have used again and again, using different wedges to divide society. But they use the same pattern, and I'll explain how that works. So you can essentially do what is commonly known as a Mad-Lib. You start out with a list of descriptors and you fill them in, and then you plug those into a narrative and it gives you your result. So you could take Marx's questions and you can take that pattern where you're going to fill everything in and you just apply it to different ways of dividing society. So the first person that applied this, or the first movement that applied this, was the neo-Marxists, who were looking at why the Marxist revolutions were not happening in the various countries that Marx predicted them to happen in. They pointed to things like, well, the system of capitalism ended up causing the middle class to flourish and to kind of be happy with their lives, where they didn't sort of want to tear down society and everything enabling the lifestyle that they came to enjoy. And so maybe the problem was that dividing by economic class was not the right way to look at the issues in society. And so Antonio Gramsci and others decided, well, we need to look, instead of economic class, look at cultural class and see how the dynamics play out there. And so they basically just did the same thing. Think of a way to divide people. Okay, cultural class. Who are the winners? The elites. Who are the losers? The lower class. What gives the winners their status? Well, the elites are the ones who want the system that put them in that elite status to stay the same. It's the status quo. It's the status quo that supports their position as elites that they want to keep. What is the ideology that enables this? Well, if you do divide system into a class-based structure and you do have elites and lower classes and you see that as the way that you should look at society, well, this form of classism is the ideology that allows you to feel that way. What is the system that enables the ideology? Well, it's really when those things that shape how culture is seen as being desirable or preferential or the status quo, all of those things are part of the matrix of power in a society. So the ideas that are considered normal, that are conveyed through our educational, legal, family, cultural systems, all the things that are the inputs to the culture of a society, if you get to control those things, then it basically allows you to define what upper class and lower class are, what constitutes norms. And the word that Gramsci came up with for this nebulous thing is hegemony. So it's the hegemonic system that allows the elites to maintain their status quo. And what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? Well, in this case, it was neo-Marxism. So you can just take these different descriptors that follow the same pattern that Karl Marx laid out in his original conflict theory paradigm, and you just plug it in. Well, the elite constructed an idea called cultural class. Being elite gives you access to a special type of property called the status quo, and the oppressed underclass, which are the lower class, are excluded from these benefits. The elite create an ideology called classism to maintain and justify this state of affairs. It permeates and structures society. This structure is called hegemony. The structure is determinate, which means your individual identity is irrelevant. Who you are, what you can think, your character, all of this is determined by your position within this structure, which is entirely determined by your cultural class. The ideology is mythological. It's a false story that everyone tells themselves because they believe it like a religion. Thus, the oppressor class are made to believe that they deserve the privileges of the status quo, while those in the oppressed class are brainwashed to accept it. Those in the underclass, the infrastructure, have no ability to influence society. It's only those in the upper class, the superstructure, that have that power. The goal of neo-Marxism is to awaken cultural class consciousness in the underclass so that they can agitate for it also to awaken in elite allies who will become the vanguard in a revolution to overthrow the existing society and replace it with a system that has no such faults. So the model that Gramsci used to call for action was to have people who carried this philosophy infiltrate education and the academy, churches, family, legal institutions in society so that they could shape the cultural milieu of society and get this idea out into the mainstream, which would cause more people to awaken to seeing society as divided this way and overthrow the institutions which maintained the status quo. Well, it turns out that that's not the only way you can do it. Later, people said, hey, this pattern actually works, but we can divide society a different way. One of the most controversial ways this took shape was in the form of what's called critical race theory. One of the first major proponents was Derek Bell, who was a Harvard law professor, and you could just fill out the form the same way. What's a way to divide people? Well, race. Who are the winners? The whites. Who are the losers? People of color. What gives winners their status? Well, whiteness. What is the ideology that enables this? Racism. What is the system that enables the ideology? Systemic racism. And what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? Critical race theory. So let's just plug and play. Whites constructed an idea called race. Being white gives one access to a special type of property called whiteness privilege. The oppressed underclass, which are the people of color, are excluded from these benefits. Whites created an ideology called racism to maintain and justify the state of affairs. It permeates structure society. The structure is called systemic racism. The structure is determinate, which means your individual identity is irrelevant. What you are, what you can think, your character, all of this is determined by your position within the structure, which is entirely determined by your race. The ideology is mythological. It's a false story everyone tells themselves because they believe it like a religion. Thus, the oppressor class are made to believe that they deserve whiteness, while those in the oppressed class are brainwashed to accept this. Those in the underclass, the infrastructure, have no ability to influence society. Those in the upper class, the superstructure, have this power. And the goal of critical race theory is to awaken race consciousness in the underclass so that they can agitate for it also to awaken in white allies who will become the vanguard in a revolution to overthrow existing society and replace it with a system that has no such faults. So this reads very similar to the type of rhetoric that you'll hear from Ibram X. Kendi, from Robin DiAngelo, from the different proponents of critical race theory. It's essentially just a roadmap, but it applies the same conflict paradigm that Marx originally laid out for dividing society by economic class. It's just using a different wedge, in this case, race. Well, it doesn't stop there, because you can also divide society by gender, and you can apply the same format. What's a way to divide people? By gender. Who are the winners? Men. Who are the losers? Women. What gives winners their status? Maleness. What's the ideology that enables this? Well, it's the patriarchy. What is the system that enables this? Well, it's systemic patriarchy or systemic sexism. And what do you call this revolutionary philosophy? Marxist feminism. Same thing, just plug and play. Men constructed an idea called gender. Being a man gives you access to a special kind of property called male privilege. The underclass, the women, are excluded from male privilege. Men have an ideology called patriarchy to maintain the state of affairs, and the structure is systemic patriarchy and yada, yada, yada. Essentially, it's the same story. It's just rather than using class or economics or race, you're using gender as a way to divide society. But then things start to get a little bit more complicated because people figured out that you can not only divide people by those very tangible things, but you can even go meta a little bit and divide by the different ways that society interacts with itself. This is most conspicuous in something called queer theory, where you take whether or not something is considered and accepted as normal, and some people aren't quite normal. And so that sense of normality is a way to divide society. And so you can just take a look at the paradigm that they use there. Think of a way to divide people. The dividing factor is normality. Who are the winners? Well, if you're a cis, heteronormal kind of person, then you're the winner. And if you're not that, then you're different. You're on the margins, particularly on the issue of sexuality and gender. If you just don't fit any of the normal boxes, then you're queer. And you're a loser in the way that this conflict is set up in order to drive the activism. What gives winners their status? What's the status marker? It's acceptance in society, being considered normal and acceptable. What is the ideology that enables this? Well, it's cis-heteronormativity. What is the system that enables the ideology? Well, it's systemic cis-heteronormativity. And what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? You call it queer theory. So now, rather than dividing by race, gender, or anything, you just divide by what society thinks normality is. So the cis-heteronormal people constructed an idea called normality. Being normal gives you access to a special kind of property called acceptance privilege. The oppressed underclass, which are queer, are excluded from these benefits. Cis-heteronormal people created an ideology called cis-heteronormativity to maintain and justify the state of affairs. It permeates and structures society, and that structure is a form of systemic cis-heteronormativity. And the structure is determinate, which means that your individual identity is irrelevant. Who you are, what you think, your character, all of this is determined by your position within the structure, which is entirely determined by your normality. The ideology is mythological, a false story that everyone tells themselves because they believe it like a religion. Thus, the oppressor class are made to believe that they deserve the acceptance privilege that they enjoy, while those in the oppressed class are brainwashed to think that they don't. Those in the underclass, the infrastructure, have no ability to influence society. It's only those in the upper class, the superstructure, that have this ability. The goal of queer theory is to awaken queer consciousness in the underclass so that they can agitate for it to awaken in the cis heteronormal allies who will become the vanguard in a revolution to overthrow existing society and replace it with a system that has no such faults. So when you see people blowing apart what appears normal and pointing to things that are accepted as normal as a form of oppression, whether that is being able to call men according to traditional definitions and women according to traditional definitions, well, those act of defining what constitutes a normal man and a normal woman are seen as a form of oppression. And it's all through this lens of how to describe and work with conflict that was originally mapped out by Karl Marx. All right. Well, this goes into even more unusual and discomforting corners when you look at ability or health. So there's an academic field that looks at disability and says, well, we can divide society into those who are able and those who are disabled. So who are the winners? Well, the abled. Who are the losers? The disabled, the crippled. What gives winners their status? Well, their ability, their health. What is the ideology that enables this? It's a form of ableism where some preference or priority is given to people who have ability. What is the system that enables this ideology? It's medicalism. It's using terms derived from medicine to define things and people that are diseased and those that are not diseased, and attaching some sort of qualitative value to that. If you're disabled, then somehow you're lesser than those who are able, and that is a form of medicalism. Well, what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? It's crip theory. So you can do the same thing. You can see how this paradigm, again, maps out. The abled constructed an idea called disability. Being able gives you access to ability privilege. The oppressed underclass, which are the disabled or the crippled, are excluded from those benefits. The abled created an ideology called ableism to justify this state of affairs, and it is fueled by medicalism, which basically means that everything that you are, what you can think, what you can be, is shaped by your ability. And the ideology is a false story that the winners believe because they think it justifies their privilege. And the goal of crip theory or disability studies is to awaken disability consciousness in the underclass so they can agitate for it to awaken in the abled allies who will become the vanguard in a revolution to overthrow existing society and replace it with a system that has no such faults. Again, this is why dividing society into winners and losers and pitting them against each other using this same format, it erodes trust between people. It creates resentment, suspicion, and paranoia between people for things that are just the fact of life. All of these things point to differences that exist in society, but you're never going to be able to rid society of differences. There are always going to be differences, and so there will always be a wedge that someone who adopts Marx's conflict paradigm can use to try to erode and destroy our institutions and the trust that they rely on. Finally, you can look at even something like how big a person is has been used in the same way to divide people. So how do you divide people? Well, whether they're fat, whether they're thin. Who are the winners? The thin. Who are the losers? The fat. What gives winners their status? Well, they have the ideal weight, or they are thin. What is the ideology that enables this? Weightism or fat phobia. And what's the system that enables this ideology? Again, it's medicalism. The idea that medical science can label who the preferred body shape is and use its terms of health to do that. People who adopt this philosophy see that as a form of medicalism. It's a form of injustice, and it's the thing that fuels this whole system. And so you can just call this way of looking at the world fat studies, plug it into the Marxist conflict paradigm, and you have your fat studies manifesto. The thin constructed an idea called fatness. Being thin gives you access to thin privilege. Fat people are excluded from it. You have an ideology called fat phobia, fueled by medicalism, that structures society and who you are doesn't matter. All that matters is where you fit on the fatness-thinness scale. And the oppressors believe that they deserve everything that is a part of thin privilege. And the fat people believe that they don't. And the goal of fat studies is to awaken fat consciousness in the underclass so that they can agitate for it to awaken in the thin allies who will become the vanguard in a revolution to overthrow existing society and replace it with a system that has no such fault. It is a utopian vision, a perfect ideal that can never be achieved, but is nonetheless used as the rationality for destroying existing systems. So just to give you an example of how you could take any difference that exists within a population and just plug and play this in and it works, you could take the idea of passing. Now, in the trans community, there are some trans people who, after they've transitioned to a different gender, have more or less success in looking and passing as their transitioned gender.
Some trans people are luckier than others. Some trans women are able to go to the grocery store and pick up their dry cleaning without anyone knowing that they're trans. Some trans men are able to get a haircut, go to the movies, and go shopping at the mall without anyone knowing that they're trans either. In the trans community, we call that passing.
And the ones who get accepted or maybe are not detected as trans individuals are described as having a form of passing privilege that those who don't have the benefit of immediately being accepted as their transitioned gender possess. And so you could take the fact that this divides the community of trans people and you could plug and play it. So let's do it. Think of a way to divide people. Well, whether or not you pass. Who are the winners? Those who pass. Who are the losers? Non-passing people. What gives the winners their status? Well, if they get accepted, then they get access to all the privileges that go along with that acceptance. What is the ideology that enables this? We'll just call it passism. The idea that, it's right for people who are able to pass to get that privilege. What is the system that enables this ideology? Well, systemic passism. All those aspects of society which place value on whether or not you can pass, which fuel the benefits that somebody could get for actually passing. All of these exist invisibly in a society to fuel the effects of passing privilege. What do you call your revolutionary philosophy? We'll call it critical passing theory, and we'll just plug and play it. The people who pass constructed an idea called passing. Being passing gives you access to a special kind of property called passing privilege. The oppressed, the non-passing, are excluded from the benefits of passing privilege. And so it's based on an ideology called passism, which is fueled by systemic passism that shapes society. So whether or not you pass determines who you are and what you are in society. And that's a system that is mythological, that the goal of critical passing theory is to awaken passing consciousness in the underclass so they can agitate for it, also to awaken in the passing allies who are going to be the vanguard in a revolution to overthrow existing society and replace it with a system that has no such faults.
When trans people pass, we are able to exist in the world without people necessarily knowing that we're trans. Passing comes with all sorts of privileges. When you pass, when you don't look trans, it can be easier to find a job, easier to find a partner, and easier to be accepted by the world around you. Passing also helps trans people avoid violence and harassment. The messed up reality is that when people can't tell that you're trans from looking at you, you're often safer. Passing is a problem.
So you could probably look at this and say, wait a second, the people who passed didn't get together and call a meeting and say, we're going to create an idea called passing. Well, the thing is, if you go back and you look at all the different lenses that we looked at before, the capitalists didn't get together and construct an idea called capitalism. It was something that evolved out of the natural processes of economic exchange. In terms of all those different ways that we've divided society and provided this narrative, the narrative is making assertions that don't accurately reflect the historical reality in all of its complexities, but it works for the purpose of fueling the resentment by driving this wedge between people so that you can push for activism and revolution.
Rather than asking trans people to pass, we need to redefine the way that we understand women, men, and people in general. There's no right way to look like a woman. There's no right way to look like a man. And for us non-binary trans folks, you shouldn't have to look like a man or like a woman in order to be treated well by those in your community.
And you could see how adopting this philosophy if you're in the trans community, will cause people who do have a greater degree of passing to be resented by those who do not. And it'll create internal strife and conflict within the community because people who have that passing privilege will be considered to be taking benefits that could otherwise be distributed to those who don't have the passing privilege in a way that is unfair, in exactly the same way that property and any of the other paradigms of this Marxist conflict theory fuel this stuff. So now we get to kind of the one ring to rule them all in terms of applying Marxist conflict theory. Because you could kind of say that while we've looked at different wedges to divide people using this Marxist conflict paradigm, several people started to realize that the more oppression identity markers that an individual had, then you could say that the greater degree of oppression that they had. And if your analysis of society didn't take this into account, then it was another form of oppression. And this is where we get the concept of intersectional oppression or intersectionality, first brought to the forefront by Kimberly Crenshaw. So, how do you apply this same pattern? Well, what's a way to divide people? Well, univariate oppression. People who only have one marker of oppression versus people who have multiple markers of oppression. Who are the winners? Well, the privileged oppressed. Those people who have very few markers of oppression. Who are the losers? The intersectionally oppressed. Those people who have multiple markers of oppression. So if you compare, for example, in the feminist movement, if you have black and white women together working for feminist equality, well, the white women are probably only working for equality between the genders, whereas the black women are not only having to contend with sexism in their fight for equality, but also racism. And if the fight that the women are fighting who are white does not include the racist dimension, well, now we've got white women who are essentially oppressing the black women because they're not actually working towards full, complete liberation of the black women because they're not taking into account their intersectional oppression. So, what gives the winners their status? Well, relative privilege. Those who only have a few markers of oppression are privileged relative to those who have multiple. What is the ideology that enables this? Univariate analysis. If you're only looking at the world through one axis of oppression, then you are enabling erasure of the realities of intersectional oppression. What is the system that enables this ideology? Well, it's systemic oppression, the fact that oppression does exist through all these different axes. But how you perform your analysis and the way that you shape policy and procedures, if you're only looking at that univariate axis of oppression, you're going to miss people. What do you call your revolutionary philosophy? Well, you can call it intersectionality, and you can just plug it and play into the same Marxist paradigm. The Intersectionality Manifesto, the privileged oppress, those with very few oppression markers, constructed an idea of univariate oppression where you just look at one thing. Think about the white feminists who were fighting the patriarchy. Well, they were only working on one axis of oppression, and that was a form of oppression against people who had multiple markers of oppression. Being a privileged oppressed person gives you access to a special kind of property called relative privilege. The oppressed underclass, which are the intersectionally oppressed, are excluded from the benefits. The privileged oppressed created an ideology, which was a method of univariate analysis to maintain and justify the state of affairs. It permeates and structures society. The structure is systemic oppression. The structure is determinate, which means your identity is irrelevant. All that matters is your degree of oppression. The ideology is mythological. The oppressors believe that they deserve their relative privilege, while those who don't. The goal of intersectionality is to awaken an intersectional consciousness in the underclass and to eventually awaken consciousness in the privileged, oppressed allies who will become the vanguard in a revolution to overthrow the existing society and replace it with a system that has no such faults. Now, it gets complicated. It gets harder to map this narrative out when you start getting so ethereal and ephemeral as this intersectionality perspective carries. But there's something to keep in mind, and that is that this intersectionality does something within the realm of those activists who adopt it in the first place. And that is when they become awakened to this intersectional consciousness, then they have to do something about it. They have to make sure that their activism incorporates this intersectional view into it. And what that means is that you now have to take into account every variable of oppression and every oppression marker that any individual has, and you have to order how you perform your activism.
something called a progressive stack, which means if you have your name on a list and you come from a traditionally marginalized background, race, gender, ethnicity, anything that is traditionally marginalized, you get bumped up the list. So this means we want to be able to hear what everyone has to say. Also, one of the things stressed at Occupy Wall Street is the step up, step back. This means people who have been privileged all their lives, mainly white men, white women even, people who have been privileged, need to realize that they need to step up and step back if they've already said what they had to say.
Isn't this supposed to be an egalitarian movement?
Kind of sort of.
That's why everybody needs to heard no matter who they come from.
Yeah, I think it doesn't matter whether, you know, what their general background is, because, you know, the majority of us are already, you know, part of the marginalized class of people. So it wouldn't matter, because more people who are under that marginalized group would get to speak anyways. And I think
I think that was clarified a lot.
what?
Would you like to speak about that?
All right, something we need to identify off the bat. When we talk about privilege, we're talking about access to institutional power. Okay, the things that come from your skin color, your sex, your class. Okay, and these are things you need to be aware of. That you have privilege over other people at different levels, or you may have less privilege than other people, depending on who you are. Yes, we may all be marginalized, but some of us are far more marginalized than others, and we need to be respectful of that.
Okay. And people have started to realize that this basically means that it foregrounds people who have multiple markers of oppression and marginalizes people who might only claim one axis of oppression. And so, whereas in the past, before you completely accept this intersectional view of dividing people and trying to rectify that division, you might have a white gay activist who is a man who is very effective at messaging, very effective at activism. But if he's now incorporating this concept of intersectional oppression, anyone who can claim more oppression markers should be centered and elevated because of those markers of oppression. And so ultimately, you're going to end up with people who are on the margin of all the various different axes of oppression. So if you have a white gay man trying to make an argument or implement a procedure and his opponent is a disabled trans woman of color, well, then you're going to give priority to the disabled trans woman of color because they rank higher on the progressive stack of intersectional oppression. And so they should be given centrality, acceptance, promotion, everything above someone who has fewer markers of oppression, because those fewer markers of oppression are a form of privilege. So you could just say that if that's a system you want to describe, you can turn this Marxist worldview in on itself and say, well, intersectionality is sort of a way to divide people. And the winners are the ones who are intersectionally oppressed because they are the ones who are given all of this privilege. And the people who are less oppressed are less privileged. And the thing that gives the winners their status is the degree of their intersectional oppression. And the ideology that enables it is, frankly, this Marxist conflict theory, because as soon as you adopt this paradigm in order to fuel your activism, to fuel your worldview that divides society and creates reasons to tear it down, well, then you're kind of stuck with looking at the world through competing groups based on these factors, and it ultimately eats itself in the form of intersectionality. And the system that enables this ideology, frankly, is systemic critical postmodern Marxism, because it's that idea where you separate reality, normality, all the different things that as humans we're grounded in, and you operate in the realm of language and culture, and you divide people using the tools that have come out of postmodernism in order to criticize, problematize, and push for complete revolution and tearing down the systems which have served as the foundation for our unprecedented prosperity. Well, you're implementing this Marxist conflict paradigm. And so if you want to move beyond this, you kind of have to go into what's called post-intersectionalism. Now, this is going to describe what happens in these. If you confine your analysis to the activist realm, you're going to see how this intersectional oppression that I've described works. And the goal then of overthrowing that system is to somehow get it so that people who have a greater degree of oppression don't get the privilege that they have, but that causes the entire thing to implode upon itself, because then you kind of have to just start from the foundational level of considering everybody to be an individual and not give rankings based on identity markers. But that's a different discussion. All right, so what to do about this? Well, there's a few closing comments. Inequalities will always exist. This is a fact of reality. Destroying the foundations of society to achieve an impossible goal will fail, undo progress, and increase suffering in the process. Achieving a state of perfect equity is a utopian ideal which cannot be achieved. Injustices and imperfections do exist in our current systems, but corrections have occurred in the past and will continue to occur. This is an incremental process. The system of liberal values, individual rights, rational empiricism, and democratic processes contain within themselves mechanisms for reform and progress, and the historically unprecedented progress, peace, affluence, and stability that we enjoy today are the result of that ongoing process. Other societies that have dismantled and overthrown their own traditional systems in favor of some form of Marxist-influenced revolutionary system have found authoritarianism, chaos, famine, and death to the tune of over 100 million dead in the wake of that destruction in the last century alone. It is a tool that only destroys and establishes domination on the basis of pure force. The destructive effect of looking at the world through any of these Marxist lenses can dissolve personal, familial, corporate, and societal relationships just as effectively as it destroys nations. Learn to recognize when this Marxist conflict paradigm, some people have called it Marxist conflict theory, learn to recognize its patterns, its contours, and when you start to see it show up in the discourse about how we need to overthrow things like Western liberal values, capitalism, just realize that this is a pattern that has been created for the express purpose of dividing people, turning them against each other, and destroying the very heart of our society that has led to the most prosperous, the least violent, the most stable form of civilization that history has record of. And if you don't believe that, then you may have already bought into some of the narrative which describes our existing system as corrupt and broken from the start. Break out of that bubble, because a lot of these criticisms intentionally overlook or obfuscate the progress that has been made. They will criticize things like race and sexuality and gender in our society based on criticisms from decades ago that have already found progress, but are nonetheless useful if they want to politically activate somebody with a revolutionary ideology. Anyway, that's it.
If you are part of the LGBTQIA community, you need to share this. And if you're an ally, step up. Body shaming of any sort is not okay. I am a thicker man, and that is okay. All you gay boys out there who shame other men for how they look, ew. And let's not forget, not dating someone because of their skin color isn't preference, it's racism. Let's not forget ableism, biphobia, transphobia, and ageism. This LGBTQI community needs a serious check, especially the gay men. And just because someone is non-binary, non-conforming, and gender fluid doesn't mean they're trying to change their gender or anything. They're just not going to fit into society's norm of what a man looks like and what a woman looks like. Because it's all actually made up from some Christian Bible that was made by a white man to suppress a bunch of slaves. Same with grammar. Stop the hate or get off my page.